Hi, folks. Welcome back to another episode of Code and Concrete, where we share the latest trends and the stories of trailblazers in the built environment. I'm your host, Matthew Schneider. I'm the CEO at Building Inc., and joining me today, I have Benjamin Toney. He describes himself as an aspiring nerd's nerd with a practitioner's background in housing policy and community development and an academic background in urban planning and development. He is especially curious about systems design, love that, especially under domestic restructure, demographic shift, and geopolitical reconfiguration. Wow, big words. We are going to have to unpack some of that. But Benjamin, you sometimes use or overuse the phrase necessary but insufficient. And, we hint at that with some of the questions later on. But really, right off the bat, I think you really undersold yourself. So I'm going to give you an opportunity. Well, first off, welcome to the show, but to introduce yourself and talk all about your background, how you got into this, what your actual credentials are.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, Matt. Really appreciate it. It's not without intent that I describe myself in certain ways. I will answer the question and then I'll answer the tacit question. So I am sort of born on the East Coast, raised in California, grew up in a household that came from a tradition of labor organizing and community organizing around policy for equitable development, and did an undergraduate degree in urban and environmental policy from Occidental College, did some community organizing work and policy advocacy work in Los Angeles in the middle of the 2010s. And since then have been working on a recently completed PhD in urban planning and development from the University of Southern California. During that time, I also did a little bit of work structuring some municipal finance tools and raising some money for producing and preserving affordable housing in the Bay Area in California. And with respect to the underselling, I think I have this intuition that inflation is really ubiquitous and it's not just price-based inflation. And I think that there is a cultural and an institutional incentive for people to really puff out their chests. And I think that's actually one of the major challenges that the American project is facing during this period of its history. And I actually think that down to the very granular details of how we think about ourselves, down to the very granular details of how we live our daily lives moment to moment, I think that there's something that's wise over the long run about really trying to understand the material bottom line base facts of where we're at, minus the bells and whistles that we sometimes use to decorate ourselves. And so credentials, super important. I actually do get the feedback from time to time that I could maybe step into my role a little bit more, with a little bit more fervor. But I think for me, I really, really care about substance. And I really, really care about accuracy. And I like to leave space for the potential for error, partly because I just think it makes a more reliable model. And for me, over the very long run, the superior model wins the day.
It's a demonstration of humility, but we do allow some humble bragging on the show. And I think it really sets the stage because you do have such a sophisticated and academic approach to this subject. And I think it's great, especially next to folks who have almost, I'd call it a little bit of street knowledge, or they're trying to break the status quo, and then you blend that beautifully with the academic and institutional approach, because ultimately these parties have to work together. So a nice blend of philosophy and mindset. But I want to unpack some more words from your introduction. If you could, rattle off some fast definitions of these. First, domestic restructure. Can you tell the audience what that means?
Yeah, I mean something pretty specific when I say domestic restructure, and it comes from my read of history. I think that many people have an intuitive understanding based on their daily lives and based on how the economy is changing, how society is changing, how institutions are changing, that it feels like America is at something of an inflection point. So when I say domestic restructure, I'm really imagining and calling out and attempting to characterize this pattern of how institutions, how private sector organizations, public sector, civil sector, and also informal social organizations and daily life is reconfiguring in a 21st century that I think, and many people think, is going to look really, really different from the last century. And so the domestic restructure is basically many of the different ways and many of the different details that are worth taking a look at regarding how American society, from an insular perspective, can reasonably expect to change over the next couple decades.
Well, it seems like it heavily coincides with the demographic shift and the geopolitical reconfiguration. These three things are happening at the same time, but it represents different circles ultimately. What do you think the domestic, like, does that represent the business side of things, private sector? Because geopolitical, political, public, demographic, people, and social, how do you kind of break these things down?
Yeah. So I think that there is a degree to which it's helpful to have distinct terms to categorize some of the patterns. I think one of the things that's challenging analytically and conceptually and ends up being territory where people debate until the cows come home, is that they're not perfectly discrete categories necessarily. And so there can be some fuzziness at the boundaries and some overlap, for example, between domestic restructure and geopolitical patterns. In fact, sometimes there can be simultaneity. Sometimes what's happening domestically can impact what happens transnationally. Sometimes what happens transnationally can impact what happens domestically. And so I guess it's more of a question of the relationship and trying to observe and measure and model in whatever large and small ways we can, learning as we go, how some of the old patterns that we were accustomed to being relatively continuous might shift and find new equilibria in this new long century we have ahead.
One of the things that you focus on and was alluded to in your introduction is the housing affordability. And I think this is one of the most blatant examples of restructuring, demographic shift, especially between the generations, the change in mentality and urban design practices that would be necessary in order to pull this off successfully. Let's start to dive into this housing shortage. Now, you point out that there might be some misconceptions about the housing shortage. So, in your opinion, how do supply, demand, and stratification, and we should define that for the audience, but how do these complicate the usual narratives about affordable, accessible housing? And how do you think that plays into the shifts that we're talking about as well?
So I think to begin, I'd like to introduce a couple territories of inquiry, of action, and of evaluation that I think form a really important foundation for thinking and talking about some of these issues. So I think on the one hand, there's a category around housing innovation, which is partly about how we produce housing, but it's also partly about how we maintain the housing that exists. There's another conversation to be had about the state of work in general and workers specifically. We're undergoing a lot of changes very rapidly, and it's probably reasonable to expect that we will have to make different types of adjustments and have different types of tactics and strategies to make sure that work is fulfilling, that it's rewarding, and that it's safe and performs the social and the financial functions that it needs to for our society to function. And I think the last framework kind of ties some of the two together, and it's about 21st century adaptations. There are some things about the world that are changing relatively slowly. There are some things about the world that are changing relatively rapidly. Regardless of who you are, it's probably reasonable to expect that people need to make specific adaptations to continue to survive, to continue to compete, and to continue to thrive in the 21st century. And so that approach of those sort of three categories, I think really informs how I think about some of these issues and how we can address some of these challenges with outcomes in mind. So, I think that one of the challenges that we face when it comes to this constant supply deficit that we've observed over recent years, over recent decades, is a change in the relationship between asset prices and wages, particularly for residential real estate. We have, through a combination of a number of different policy decisions, through a combination of a number of different market conditions and behaviors, particularly over the last 25 years, experienced a pretty substantial divergence between wages and the cost of producing and operating real estate. And on a per project basis, that's kind of a structural problem because typically when developers are building, they're sort of financing on a basis of the ability to pass costs to wage earners, particularly for rental real estate. Sort of cash flow looks a little bit different for ownership tenure. But in short, we do have a large structural problem that extends beyond the procedural considerations around permit and approval bottlenecks, some of the strategies to other streamlining strategies procedurally at local levels, like producing pre-approved plans that have been very popular among ADU housing unit production strategies and, also approved as a policy strategy in the state of Oregon a couple of weeks ago. As much as changing some of the land use zoning, as much as changing some of the sort of permit and approval and procedural process for unlocking and removing red tape that impedes the speed of development, the market fundamentals still probably play an important role in influencing the rate at which we can actually add units consistently, right? Not just ad hoc supply inundation treatments that last for 2 years and then the market has to recover because it takes time for demand to get redistributed across a now larger housing stock. And so I think this sort of fundamental challenge of wages, both in terms of their aggregate intensity, wages in terms of their spatial distribution with respect to how different sectors of the economy are developing in terms of spatial distribution across states and within states, really informs the sort of geography where housing can be built just on base financial fundamentals of financing construction and permanent operations by sort of charging wage earners.
So lots to unpack there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tie it back to the main narrative here, which is that we're calling for restructuring. We're witnessing shifts of demographics and practices, mentalities, things that are infused into the generations. How does that play into the resolutions that you're proposing to, this lack of equilibrium ultimately in the housing market?
Yeah. Well, I think that one of the challenges for what I have in mind, and I think this is one of the challenges for policymakers and for policy implementation writ large, is that in cases where we need really monumental and substantial changes to how systems function, there tends to be an inverse sort of resource intensity relationship, right? Bigger changes cost more to make and tend to be more disruptive and therefore tend to face more resistance in the process of carrying out. And so I do want to preface that many of the preferences that I have and many of the opinions that I have are kind of like 30-year projects or 40-year projects if we're really diligent and really effective and make few mistakes. But I do think that type of bold, big picture, maybe perceivedly unlikely avenue of sort of change and development of domestic institutions is something that I guess we do see in some respect with respect to some of the changes around Project 2025 policies, just as an order of magnitude with respect to the intensity with which we're making changes. I think part of the challenge for me with many of those policies is that they do tend to intensify some of that stratification and intensify some of that inequality from both an income perspective and a wealth perspective. And I think that that places barriers to entry, barriers to retention, and barriers to advancement for folks who are in bottom quartile, below median, even just in the bottom 75% of households from an income or a wealth perspective. And so, I think that finding a multiple avenue strategy to perform not just investment, but distributed investment that's thoughtful about how folks at all kinds of different positions are benefiting in compounding ways that increase their security is part of the challenge that's ahead of us. And so I'm not sure if I actually answered your question directly.
Well, let me rephrase the question. That was a good answer. I have to reiterate that this is a difficult question and answer because there's multiple systems that we're describing here. There's multiple shifts happening. There's multiple systems at play. There's many, as you said, avenues within each of these that we could go. And then ultimately you have to measure the effectiveness. Everything is, you could be doing well in one area, but how is it being distributed across others? So it's not a straightforward answer, but for folks to digest something, I think looking at the systems, we lightly described there's policy, zoning, permitting. There's also the basic economics of the markets and the trade that is happening in each of these jurisdictions that powers this. And then there's also, the distribution of wealth. Maybe we'll start with priorities. How do we prioritize and execute off of the myriad of systems that are clearly dysfunctional currently? And I do think that over the next 30, 40 years, we could start to untangle these because they're sort of like spaghetti right now. But where do we start in that untangling?
Yeah, I think that related to my prior answer about the resource intensity, depending on the level that you're entering at, probably you got to get some base hits before you swing for the fences in some cases. There are occasionally individuals, organizations, entities that have the ability to step up to the plate and hit a home run. We're not all Shohei Ohtani. We do our best. I think that continuing to do work that has been ongoing for decades and generations of structuring local democratic institutions, practices, partnerships between governments, civil society organizations, philanthropy, and the private sector, and producing short-term, tangible, winnable campaigns that improve some of the economic performance in terms of overall growth and also in terms of distribution across the sort of spatial context and across the social context.
What would be an example, though, of a short-term campaign win?
Yeah. So I think some of the work that folks are doing to enhance access to affordable first-time home ownership is one really important example that there has been some progress sort of made regarding. Some of that comes through strategies like ADU development. Some of that comes through policy strategies at the local and state level, for example, in California, where policies to enable lot splitting, policies to enable densification of detached single-family homes has created financially feasible avenues to produce units that cost less on a per unit basis and whose sort of cost savings are able to be passed on to end users and those sort of first-time home buyers. So that's sort of one example. I think that other examples that are on their way that haven't necessarily achieved sort of solution status quite yet, but that have been building momentum nationwide are strategies around missing middle housing typologies, both in terms of changing some of the land use restrictions to permit those buildings to be built, changing some of the building code requirements, for example, single stair reform, to allow building types that have been built before in the United States, to allow building types that demonstrate worldwide that they are safe, that they're functional, that they're operational, and that they're financially feasible, I think are important examples of working within the constraints that we are operating under today. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in addressing some of the more challenging financial distribution problems that some of these very substantial but somewhat edge case policy strategies and development strategies, continue to leave perhaps uncovered for certain segments of the population.
One of my interpretations of that response is that policy is going to stimulate new developments and redevelopments. And I think this is an opportunity to segue into the existing housing stock and where some of those problems lie. In one of our first conversations, you had mentioned how deferred maintenance across the housing stock was causing problems, and potentially even infrastructure collapse. But it does pose an opportunity as well to go in and start to resolve some of these century-old issues that we are still dealing with today, and potentially do things correctly this time around. So what does that look like because there's two roads. We've reached a fork in the road. There's new developments, what do they call it? Greenfield opportunities, but most of the U.S. is a brownfield where a redevelopment of the existing stock is going to be necessary. And I'm sure codifications and policy and permitting play into both of those. But let's focus now on the existing stock. One, what are the problems that are facing the existing stock, and then tying in the potential policy and permitting reformation, how could this course correct?
I think there is some degree of consensus, with maybe some edge case disagreements, that we need to be building more housing. I think one of the challenges with respect to gross production is that its net impact is partly informed by whether the incumbent stock is continuous and reliable. Right. So in other cases, and in other words, if we build 20% more units, but the prior units fall apart at a rate of 10% during that time, we only have 10% net new units. And so this rate of construction is really, really, really important. And the rate of decay for the units that already exist is also really, really, really important in order to have the impact that we're hoping that new construction will have. And there are a couple of extreme cases where I think this dynamic plays out sort of as a harbinger for what inadequate preparation and bolstering of the incumbent stock, both in terms of the sort of physical structures that are specific to each parcel, and in terms of the systems that help to protect groups of housing across neighborhoods. And, one of the unfortunate examples for the years and the decades moving forward, starts with the fires that sort of tore across Los Angeles at the start of this year. I think that, much of the conversation around the response has involved a combination of people coming together, building new systems, deploying resources, and trying to help people rebuild as rapidly and as seamlessly as possible. I also think that there's been a substantial amount of essentially trying to find individuals or groups to blame. And I think part of the challenging conversation that I would find to be more productive moving forward is an acknowledgement that the risk of that type of event is kind of a little bit higher over the next 80 years than it was over the prior 80 years. And so we, in fact, don't actually have adequate preventive systems, adequate systems for recourse and repair and rebuilding after the fact. And all of those challenges present really excellent opportunities for innovation among private sector entities, among public sector entities, in the philanthropic space, among impact capital. But I also think that there's a really challenging conversation to be had about characterizing the risk that is distributed across the stock that currently exists. And some of that is the risk of these massive punctual events that, take out a substantial portion of the housing stock. But even sometimes a little bit more difficult to observe, difficult to model, and difficult to mobilize around are some of these slower processes of decay, are some of the mechanical, electrical, plumbing issues, some of the, other structural foundational issues, other issues around indoor air pollution, whether it's plastic microparticulates, whether it's endemic mold, whether it's carcinogens in upholstery for certain furniture products. We have, I think, a deficit of certain types of data and of certain granularities of data to even be able to characterize the problem. And so in some cases, when we propose solutions, it's possible that there is a misdiagnosis. And even if there isn't necessarily a disqualifyingly large misdiagnosis today, there is some risk of that gap between what we think is going on in the housing stock and what's actually going on. And so, that is some of the risk and some of the challenge that I'm really interested in trying to find new ways. Whoever is going to take on the task, whoever is going to take on the responsibility of trying to build systems that help us to measure and to mitigate and to protect against some of that risk that can be distributed across the housing stock. Because again, to the degree that we experience quality declines in housing, those circumstances can have ripple effect consequences in people's financial well-being. If you have health issues that are being caused by your housing unit, that can impact how much you're paying in medical expenses, right? And so I think trying to have a better understanding of how some of these quality conditions impact sort of daily life conditions, quality of life conditions for people, and some of the price consequences, some of the income, some of the net income consequences, and some of the long-term wealth consequences, I think are important considerations, excellent territory for new research, and excellent territory for us to experiment with new systems that try to absorb and mitigate some of that risk in the years to come.
Well, it's all very fascinating, and I have to admit, I really appreciate looking at the housing problem as not just how fast can we build new stuff, but how fast can we quantify the decay of the existing stock and work to redevelop that, because not a lot of people take that into consideration. And you said, what is the actual net new housing when you not just look at what's being built? We can build all the neighborhoods we want, but if you have the natural decay of these neighborhoods, of existing neighborhoods, plus the acceleration that is inflicted upon them by, say, climate events, well, you realize that we are really not catching up to speed. And then you have the ripple effect that comes from the potential poor quality of the existing stock or the current stock, right? What we're building now, because if the margins are thinner, then perhaps we build with lesser materials, or we're not taking into other prolonged considerations. We're not thinking about the long term, and these issues continue to pile up over time. And as you alluded to, I mean, this is systems thinking. Everything is impacted in some way. The health of people because of improperly built buildings historically or now, that could add up, and then they're disaffected in some way. The neighborhoods, and then the income levels, and then the services that have to be provided, and the development that goes into that. It's a butterfly flapping its wings, and tsunamis are happening, and we're witnessing decades and decades of hordes of butterflies flapping their wings, and now it's all crashing down on us in some ways. The effect of climate and systems that concentrate wealth in some areas. You also have, for example, the maintenance of properties. You're talking about, how well are we maintaining these, and what are the data systems? What's the information infrastructure that we have to maintain them properly? Has it existed? For the most part, no, right? So that's accumulated over decades, and now we're not really sure what's going on with our properties. We're trying to infuse that into some of our new developments, but a lot of folks are still leaving that out because of the costs associated with trying to track all that data and technology. But the cost of the technology and the SaaS, I mean, that's heavily influenced by other factors. And then you could start talking about venture capital. So you have this crazy, I mean, it's pure chaos in many regards. And that's why, in one of my questions, I said, how do we start to prioritize and execute? And I think that the top-down approach, you say, well, let's, what can we do with policy and permitting, and can we get these public-private partnerships going, because those are ultimately the decision makers. And so, some people might interpret it as band-aid solutions to some of the problems that are going on. But if you are bleeding out, we're well aware of the wounds, but let's start with some basic bandages just to stop the bleeding and prevent further damage. But naturally, it's conversations like this and the folks thinking about urban design and the technologies and the innovation, which is one of your frameworks that go into that, to say, all right, we've bought ourselves some time. Now, how do we go back to the drawing board and set the record straight for the next 100 years? To me, that's what you've said. And I don't know if that was an accurate assessment.
No, that is what I've said. I think I probably didn't complete the thought. I think that you got to win what you can incrementally, but it's got to be oriented in a similar direction so that it can compound to something that's bigger. You don't want to just get base hits and hit singles. You got to bring your runners home. So, I will say for me, one of the things that I think is a really exciting policy proposal is to take a look at the expenditures of different departments and federal agencies, specifically looking at HUD, and this is work that's outlined by a scholar, Murtaza Baksamusa, in, I believe, a 2020 book, taking a look at a new model for affordable housing finance. And he outlines part of the pattern of the decline in proportional public investment in money that flowed through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, where around the time of late 60s, early 70s, the expenditures as a percentage of GDP hovered, I believe, around about 7%. And experienced a marked decline proportionately to about 1% of GDP by the time of publication. I think around 2019 was the last data point in that sort of chart and trajectory. Now, again, GDP grows over that time, and a whole bunch of other prices change, cost of labor changes, cost of transportation changes, land holding costs change, land costs change. And so that doesn't necessarily paint the whole picture. But I do think that one of the challenges that we face right now is that there's an expectation that the private sector is going to innovate without a risk absorption mechanism. And this is, I think, part of where the public-private utility can really come into play. Private sector actors, if they have a business model that works satisfactorily, they don't always want to experiment with something that doesn't necessarily have the same rate of return. And this is one of the things that we actually see happening in the modular housing production sort of subset of the industry. It's challenging to get financial institutions to make decisions on a basis of a much smaller universe of modular projects when they've got hundreds of thousands of stick-built projects where whether the risk is larger or smaller isn't always necessarily as important to decision making as whether the risk is familiar or whether the risk is unknown. I think at the same time, you've also got contractors who maybe are more familiar with stick-built practices on site. And to the degree that on a single project basis, maybe they can train up and make the adjustments that are necessary to be able to perform, whether it's volumetric, where you're kind of stacking pre-built units, or panelized, where you have sort of subcomponents that are being assembled on site. There's still a deal flow issue for those contractors. And whether you can do one project and whether you can structure a pipeline that gives you confidence in your business's ability to grow is kind of a whole different conversation. And in order to experiment with some of these new strategies, there is some risk that's involved. And I think one of the things that's particularly challenging, again, from a private sector innovation standpoint that is agnostic or maybe underemphasizing the role that the state can play, is that, when you don't have a pot of money that the state can use to essentially absorb some of the productive failures as you figure out how to get the system to really sing, it makes it very, very challenging to perform those trajectories of innovation. Now, maybe there's some other trajectory of innovation that we could follow, but I think that in general, this role that the state can play in helping industries fail productively moving forward, it's not like we don't do it. Right? It's just that a lot of the resources are sort of clustered around a couple of key sectors and industries, right? Namely, some of the technology industries, some of the sort of information economy industries, right? There's no shortage of a list of companies that have been granted the ability to not turn a profit year after year after year after year as they, corner market share and sort of scale out their operations. And so I think one of the things that I like as a long-term goal to orient our incremental wins towards is something like trying to get HUD expenditures to 5% of GDP and trying to change some of the role that it plays with respect to how it prioritizes and how it spends some of that money. And so being able to risk pool for innovative production and maintenance and reproduction strategies, I think is an excellent long-term goal. It's probably going to take a lot of money. I think to some degree, there will probably be some reconfiguration of the subsidy model for production. I think we're already seeing that in some ways. And there is some degree of a challenge when the gap between ability to pay and cost to produce and operate continues to grow. There is some degree of a challenge to constantly be backfilling that gap. And so, I think that one of the other strategies that I would really love to see prioritized in, what's essentially a much more inflated housing and urban development department would be really prioritizing infrastructure that supports the resilience of not only individual buildings, but neighborhoods as well. And then also thinking about, in addition to physical infrastructure, really thinking about a public sector apparatus for data infrastructure and really thinking about shifting some of the existing patterns around how data is reported, around how data reporting is penalized. Right? One of the challenges that we have with even being able to understand the actual conditions of housing is that if people reveal information about their housing in some cases, there's a price penalty, right? If you have $250,000 worth of plumbing work that you need to do in a single family home, as soon as you reveal that information, you can experience, a sort of price response from buyers who are kind of working that into their model as they assess financial feasibility. And so I think that there's actually a really creative opportunity to try to build data systems that permit communication transfer along some relationships and sort of preserve some of the existing industry practices around how buyers and sellers and other operators and actors in the field transact. And so that's some of the territory that I'm interested in exploring. And again, we're kind of in an area where we're going to get to do some experimenting and there's going to be some failure. And I think that this is one of the really painful and challenging, sobering realities. And this is, again, part of why I start with, what could be called underselling, but what I would want to call really kind of baselining. And, I want to try to build systems that don't oversell what they provide and that don't maybe hide costs as frequently or as intensely as some of our systems do.
Well, I like that we started to dive into information infrastructure or data infrastructure, and then we can start to contextualize it. It becomes information. We make better decisions about the world around us. It's so severely lacking in many industries, but particularly in real estate, which is shocking because the built environment is all that we know. It's everything around us. It consumes our lives. It makes up our lives. So to think that it is so opaque, highly fragmented, antiquated, inefficient, it's shocking. And the solutions that are out there for the most part their net positivity is questionable. And you alluded to that with, the price that the end user pays for participating in that system. That's something to be highlighted. There's not just the cost of these softwares, but how or these systems or these innovations, products, services, however you frame it, but the unseen costs that it has on people, and then their determination whether or not they want to participate in that, if they play by the rules or if they try to find loopholes to get out of it. A very simple example, at least in my world, is the appraisal process and how you might appraise a property to arrive to a valuation, but then perhaps the land taxes, property taxes that you have to pay on that. So people will purposely, if it's not required of them, not appraise the assets for many years at a time. But this means that you don't have a third-party mark. And if you are dealing with investors or insurance companies or other stakeholders, you have this asymmetry between what the property actually is and what the records suggest, especially those that are revealed to important stakeholders or shareholders. And it has this negative compounding effect over time. And it's why a lot of capital isn't flowing into real estate to offer the renovations or the stimulation that we'd like, because there's these tiny, I don't know if tiny is the right way to describe it. It's like death by paper cuts, essentially, that mount up in real estate, and you accumulate them over time as you try to go about bettering the stock that you have, your portfolio, but then fines and expenses and taxes and costs and all these things that just ultimately, if you can avoid them for as long as you could or make them someone else's problem, you would. And that sort of mental and information and infrastructure corruption, it has a damning effect, is how I would describe it. It's not good for society as a whole. And so if we could tackle this at its core and have some sort of system, as you've suggested, that awards participation and benefits people, then that's great. A very simple example that I think people could resonate with is when you are raising children, you want your kids to tell you the truth. And so if you say, hey, little Timmy, did you do that? Did you take a cookie? And if they know by saying yes, they're going to be punished harshly, guess what? You have taught them to lie. So it's kind of like that for real estate, where if we try to get information out of people and then we punish them immediately for participating in the system, guess what? They are not going to, and this leads to all sorts of corruption and exemplified risks. Anyways, I'll get off my soapbox.
Oh no, this is just where I want to go. This is great.
Well, is there anything that you'd add to my little monologue there?
Yeah. So firstly, you said you're shocked. I'm not shocked. Why would we be shocked? Right? So we're a millennial generation, right?
Gen Z. I am.
You're Gen Z. Okay. Yeah. Well, you're just precocious. That's great. So we're there's a cultural discourse and kind of like meme content around boomers, right? Around the baby boomer generation. And about, them hoarding wealth or hoarding resources, or, they bought homes when they were cheaper and now the barrier to entry is higher, and they have old expectations about what it takes to actually compete in today's society and in today's world. I have this model in my head that I think of as like cyclical incumbency, which is fancy words for the idea that whoever is kind of already there first is going to want to stay there, and that they have to be outcompeted for that position. And so when I think about the incentives and preferences that people have, I'm not necessarily shocked that there's some degree of antiquated practices, and that standard, right? And this is kind of the point and the function and the structure of the status quo, is that it does create and preserve advantage for some group. And right. As long as they have the ability to maintain that, probably reasonable to expect that they will. And yes. So this is, I think, part of the adaptation and part of the adjustment that particularly younger generations, I think, will benefit from this century, is to have a really challenging conversation about what you want versus what you can win. And you don't have to completely sacrifice what you want, but you might have to win a couple contests in a row before you're able to achieve some of those larger goals. I think with respect to data and with respect to how incentives are currently structured, I think, again, there's just a tremendous opportunity for somebody to figure out how to build a system that has a different set of incentives, and then to execute the transition of facilitating the move from where we're at to this new system and this new equilibrium. There are already, I think, baby step prototype examples of some of these sort of strategies and practices. One of which, I think, actually, to kind of tie back to the multiple components of housing affordability conversation and insurance and climate risk and fire, has to do with fire insurance coverage. So there are some companies that have a multi-tiered pricing strategy for the cost of insurance, where the price that an individual pays is a composite of both a sort of regional risk score, which is informed by what's happening maybe outside of the boundaries of their property. Is this a place that has high fuel density? Is this a place that has low precipitation, low moisture, low water? Is this a place that's likely to burn, based on what we know so far? They also have an individual level indicator based on the performances that the individual performs on their parcel. And so there is a way to structure a performance-based, merit-based, individual behavior incentive where if you do a good job of removing fuel density, if you do a good job of keeping, for example, large trees or other objects that could spread fire to the building, if you're able to kind of clear and control and de-risk your parcel, you can actually get a lower individual level score. And then the price that you pay is some sort of combination of your regional risk and your local risk. That type of strategy, I think, is something that can be applied to a bunch of different contexts. And I think further, with respect to some of the challenges that we have about not only the net production of housing, but a further complication of where the net production of housing is currently being built. One of the challenges that we face is that the highly desirable land tends to be a little bit more expensive. And some of the highly desirable land is, in some cases, areas that are safer from a climate perspective. They might have a lower likelihood of flood. They might have a lower likelihood of fire. And over time, to the degree that price doesn't factor those things in today, part of what we're seeing is that markets are adjusting and starting to price some of that risk in. I think that there's also an opportunity to take a look at, and this is again trying to find tangible examples of things that we can do, building off of what we've already got. I think that there could be a potential application of an element of that regional risk score that has something to do with the rate of production of safe units, right? So when we think about how insurance costs go up over time, it's a function probably of a bunch of different factors. But certainly the number of claims that are being pulled from the fund is probably one of them, right? To the degree that more people are experiencing the unfortunate events, and to the degree that there are more payouts, it's reasonable to expect that insurance companies are either going to raise costs or lower the coverage that they provide, or in some cases, as we're seeing across the country, actually stop covering certain geographies because they don't fit the business model and the sort of total risk profile at the moment. I think that some of that is made more challenging by the fact that it's kind of more affordable to build in risky areas because of the sort of price dynamics around land. I think one of the things that we could take a look at, which again is going to face some political friction, is going to face some economic friction based on incumbents not wanting to change. But if there is a neighborhood, a city, a region that is relatively safe, that could be building safe units at a faster rate, there is kind of this counterfactual of the rate of risk pooling, where if they were building relatively safe units, we'd be able to kind of pool risk in those units at a faster rate and on average slow down the rate at which prices increase for everybody. And so I think that hypothetically, there could be a way to have basically an underproduction premium that's applied to a regional score for insurance price that says, hey, there's sort of an expectation, and this is something that can kind of dovetail with some of the public policy tools that are being used to try to incentivize a particular rate of production of units and a distribution, particularly in places that have underproduced housing and that have a high jobs to housing mismatch where there's way more jobs than there is housing. I think that those are territories where there is opportunity for looking at how the price mechanism can actually be leveraged to, I guess, reconfigure how risk is distributed and how it's absorbed and how the production of new housing can sort of dovetail and cohere with the maintenance and the risk protection of the existing stock. It is totally fair, for the record, if that's not 100% clear. I'm kind of making it up and connecting something that already exists to something that might exist. Again, this is one of those things where someone's got to do the research, someone's got to do the math, and there's both the logistics of, is this even something that could work as a point B destination. And then there's the also meta costs of traveling the path from point A, where we're at today, traveling path AB to that final destination also costs something politically, logistically. There are opportunity costs to other ventures that people are more confident in the sort of return profile for. And so, again, lots of opportunity for innovative approaches and lots of territory, whether it's in production, whether it's in preservation, whether it's looking at insurance, whether it's looking at utilities, whether it's looking at sort of the materials with which units are built to try to sort of save money on energy costs. You don't want to be heating the buffer just outside your building. You don't like heat leaking out of the building over long periods of time, right? Those are things that raise your costs of operations, for owners, for users, for operators. And so lots and lots of territories for experimentation. I think, again, part of the challenge that we face is that it's really, really difficult to internalize these risks in a context in which people are dealing with labor market uncertainties across industries, particularly in construction. When people are dealing with uncertainties around supply chain issues, whether it's price or whether it's timing, associated with different foreign policy considerations. I think that as aggregate risk kind of goes up and as people become more risk averse, I think we feel the pain of not having a robust domestic public sector that is dedicated to helping to absorb and to mitigate some of that risk, that enables us to develop innovative systems, that enables us to kind of fumble through that process of getting to something that works. And so that's one of those territories that I'm really excited about. It is probably a little bit impossible to get done in the next couple of years. And so my hope is that if I can talk about it every day for the next couple decades, and if a couple other people can talk about it every day for the next couple decades, maybe we can increase the likelihood that it becomes possible.
Well, it's really intriguing thoughts. Definitely some food for thought. Gives people something to chew on, especially the whole risk and policy and insurance. There's no straight answer, but maybe some calculations could be scribbled out. People could start playing with it. Someone's going to attempt it, and we'll see if it's, as a theory, comprehensive and applicable or not. A couple of things I wanted to comment on. So, we were talking about the incumbents and how they have this advantage. They really want to stick around naturally. Something that coincides with that is this idea of a corrupt and inefficient system. There's a lot of money that's made off of the system being that way. Those incumbent parties that stand to benefit from things not being done correctly. The most dominant example being rework or change orders or some sort of repair and fixing. And this is reflective in a lot of new technologies or manufacturing at large. And I was talking about earlier how we are not building with the long term in mind. At least we could say 100 years ago, and maybe I'm giving the benefit of the doubt, but I feel as though we constructed more soundly than oftentimes we are today. And some of that is because of profit margins or trying to get around certain regulations and codes and just doing whatever. But we feel like things are always breaking down, right? These buildings aren't meant to last. Meanwhile, you'll have structures from 300 years ago and will complement the craftsmanship. So we have to get away from that practice. We have to go back to building for the long term and find other ways to make money, which goes into my next point, which is, okay, the incumbents exist. They make a lot of money off of doing things maybe incorrectly, or they're counting on repairs and servicing every 5 years, or having to outright redevelop a building maybe every 20 years and just repurposing it. But if we can demonstrate a way to make more money off of doing things the right way, and I think that's my point. If we can find a way to make more money off of doing things the right way, some sort of incentive has to exist there, or that transition is not going to happen. What does that look like? That's where some of the creative entrepreneurship is required, and it's emerging. We're starting to see this with blockchain, actually, a demonstration of transparency on these assets to show that they were constructed for longevity is applying premiums to the asset value. And so the developer has a financial incentive when they refinance or when they sell to 12 months prior, 24 months prior, design very carefully, construct very carefully, knowing that it's going to be paid for in the long run. It's like an investment. You want to invest in best practices, invest in technology, and it's going to accrue value. And if you can demonstrate that, then more folks will get on board. Another really good example would be building information modeling. People say, well, why would I invest into BIM? Do I care about the software or the phasing or the best practices? But as soon as you see it as an investment, that maybe you need the specialists or the software, or you're going to spend a little bit more time in the design phase, but the building is more robust and comprehensive and technologically enabled, and then stands the test of time and therefore is more attractive to the future buyer, and they're going to be paying more. Naturally, you see the benefits of it there. And then if there's other incentives as well, because you can get the outcome you want by penalizing or incentivizing behavior ultimately. And so either you have, a government body that says you have to build this way because we're thinking about the long term of the country, or you just let the so-called invisible hand of the private markets guide the practices, and people will say, well, I'm going to make more money this way, so I'll do it this way. And hopefully that's just the best route. There's definitely a mismatch there where the invisible hand has not guided the market into something that is net positive for society, I would say, maybe immediately profitable, but there's obviously a clear distinction between profits and people in the future of this empire, the American empire. That's what I have to say about that.
So I think you touch on something that is related to, I think I speak about it in a slightly different permutation, but I think part of the leverage that I think might be useful for folks who are in this territory in terms of selling and pitching to both audiences, both the federal top-down domestic policy audience and to the private sector market audience, which, and again, kind of beating a dead horse here, I really think that there is relevant strategic execution considerations for including a comprehensive approach that targets both of those audiences, because I do think that they both have, honestly, a reciprocal role to play. I think that as leverage, the degree to which a geopolitical competition narrative can be structured and deployed to be able to say, part of the reason that we need to have a more reliable floor for both the actual quality conditions and the reporting of those quality conditions is that it puts us in a better position to be able to compete in a totally different global marketplace. We need people to have stability in their lives to be able to do the upskilling that's required for shifting industries, shifting careers, shifting sectors. We need people to have the stability of having housing that they can expect enhances their health rather than deteriorates their health, in order for them to be optimally aligned and optimally productive, not only in their sort of sub-industry in the economy, but in their sort of puzzle piece position in the larger picture of how this place is going to work and compete. And so I am really interested in continuing to try to configure some of that messaging. I'm not necessarily sure how well it lands. This is part of my experimentation and my bias, and we will be getting feedback and performing updates throughout the process. But I think that a system that develops the ability to better predict, to take a preventive maintenance approach rather than a wait until things fall apart and and then scramble to try to fix things is not only a wiser strategy over the long run before the last couple of years, but also dynamic pricing is going to look a little bit different over the decades to come. We've seen this in recent reports in the airline industry, right? There are airlines who are experimenting with, complex data systems to really evaluate the level of pressure that a particular buyer might be under for purchasing a flight. And for a person who is in a particular situation where the intensity of demand that they have actually does mean that they might pay a little bit more, particularly if they don't know that other people are paying less. This kind of situation where, if you have a plumbing catastrophe because you weren't paying attention to a slowly creeping, incrementally growing problem, it's possible that in the future, there might be a price premium for you to pay in the event in which, and again, I'm speculating here, but in the event in which that industry took that type of AI system to do that type of very context-dependent dynamic pricing to basically get a little bit more money out of a person who's in a position of desperation. And so I think that these are some of the cost trajectory considerations that it's very, very difficult for us to have conversations about. One, because it's theoretical and hypothetical. And I think this is part of the challenging conversation. And again, for me, the sandbagging is very intentional. And it's about creating space for me to speak legitimately about the data that I don't have. And I think this is one of the really challenging conversations for us to have this century and the next several centuries. The most important data until the heat death of the universe is the data that you don't have. It is the most important information. And as soon as you collect data, you move the goalpost. And now the stuff beyond the new frontier is where the uncertainty comes from, right? And so I think it's really, really important for us to build out data infrastructure. I think it's really, really important for us to do a better job of measuring the actual chemical and physical activity that occurs, right? Sometimes deviated from price, right? Part of what you were talking about before is what I refer to as the dislocation of price from certain aspects of quality. This is a thing that, when we talk about the valuation of real estate, it sometimes has more to do with the position of land relative to other things than the conditions of the building. This is well known. This is well established. It incentivizes certain behaviors and it disincentivizes other behaviors. And I think part of the point that we're exploring in this conversation, without coming to definitive answers that everybody has to follow today, is that may have been advantageous for a particular period of time and for a particular context. And we might be early. I can't tell if we're early or late. But part of what we're gambling and part of what we're betting and where we place our chips is on the premise that what will be advantageous in the near and midterm and distant future is a set of functions, a set of practices, a tradition of pricing that functions quite differently from where we're at today. And there's a very challenging process of even communicating that in a way that's legible to multiple different audiences. I don't even understand what I'm saying half the time. But I think that there is, what I get really excited about is a forward-thinking approach that tries to understand how some of the progress indicators that we are accustomed to using to measure performance might actually not be good enough to put us in the individual level and the group level competitive position that we would really like to be in on average over time. And so I think I'm really excited to have conversations about data. I'm really excited to have very painful conversations about the data that we don't have, about the risks that we perceive, our ability to measure them to the degree that we can, and our decision-making processes under uncertain risk. Because I think that that's actually a muscle that is dramatically underdeveloped across, honestly, leadership in the public sector, the private sector, the civil sector, social society, and myself. And so I really think we all have room to grow in improving both measuring risk and being careful in how we navigate it.
Well, that is a perfect place to wrap up. And Benjamin, I'm glad that you want to have the conversations. This is your call to action time. Now, in the show notes, I'm going to have your LinkedIn, but are there other ways that people should be reaching out to you and getting involved? Or is there anything that you're working on that you'd like people to know about? How do we start to see the application of all this theory and these concepts that you've just laid out before us?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I am on the precipice of starting to release some of the early stage products and processes around working to facilitate some of this transition. Again, some of it is logistic, some of this is political, some of this is a systems development sort of standpoint, and some of it's around research and communications. At this particular point in time, I would say connecting with me on LinkedIn is a great way to stay updated, and that will enable people to stay abreast as we start to roll out some of these pieces.
And when you say we, who is that?
So I'm in the process of finalizing a contract with a firm that provides legal services around development, does some policy work and architecture and design services, that is launching a partner organization that will do some strategic research and communications. And so I want to make sure that we get all of the I's dotted and T's crossed and before calling it out all of the way. But working with an organization that's California based and starting to build out a national network of folks who are interested in this type of work.
Okay. Very interesting. Well, there's the CTA right there. So a potential national network of folks who can participate, communicate at this level on a myriad of concepts, probably from a variety of backgrounds. And very good to see that you are practically applying these concepts. They're not just crazy ideas. We can actually act on them. We can roll them out, and hopefully they have massive benefit to our communities locally, and then as we work on this together at large, uplift the country that we're in. I think that level of collaboration and forward thinking is very long overdue. We're paying a price for it, for sure. And these younger generations are fed up, to say the least, not to throw boomers under the bus or anything. But, well, fantastic. Benjamin, I've enjoyed the conversation. Definitely one of the more complex and sophisticated conversations. But that happens when you start talking about systems because they're so intricate. It really takes a level of abstract thinking, especially because systems in the way that we've described them are meta. It's not just one instance of you need tech or pass this policy or file your permitting this way, like allow triple deckers instead of single story. No, it's actually much more complex than that. There's like a moving million parts and we're trying to come together and describe them. And this is a demonstration of how challenging it can be because of the interrelationships that exist between all the parts. You want to talk about one thing and immediately you have to mention how it impacts other areas and the people and the politics and the profits. But we're on the way to solving this, and I think it's the most meaningful thing that we could be doing with our lives. It is literally course correcting like civilization as we know it. I think that's inspirational, and I hope that, you know, all the folks who have tuned into this and past episodes of Code and Concrete, especially the most recent episode with Paul Doherty, and he talks about designing the future of cities and what smarter cities looks like. I hope this is inspirational. You know, I want to see some people taking action and going out there and designing better and architecting and engineering abstractly, not, you know, just the actual architecting and engineering, but how we go about crafting these systems or the technology that governs systems or the governing bodies themselves. That is enough of my soapbox. So, Benjamin, again, I appreciate your time, appreciate everyone that tuned in. Drop 5 stars, like, subscribe, wherever you're listening to, and wishing you all the best in the near future.
Appreciate it. And I will check out not only the most recent, but a number of the recent podcasts. Thank you for the plug. Appreciate that.
Always. Take care.
All right. Take care now.